Aloha. Welcome to Light Drama Action. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe. And let's get to the content for today. Peace.
Before we begin, I want to offer a clear and firm warning. What you are about to hear contains graphic descriptions. This content is intended for mature audiences only. Listener discretion is strongly advised, and remember, all individuals mentioned in this video, including Mr. Combs, are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. If you're joining us for the first time, full summaries for days 1 through 18 are available on the video tab of this channel. The 19th day of Sean Diddy Combs' federal trial opened with a palpable tension in the Manhattan courtroom. Before the jury was brought in, Judge Arun Subramanian, a tall, measured presence presiding over the case, announced he would delay ruling on the defense's mistrial motion until Tuesday, leaving a cloud of uncertainty hanging over the proceedings. Combs, seated at the defense table in a tailored dark suit, clasped his hands and listened intently. His fate remained precariously in the balance. The hip-hop mogul faces racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking charges that could mean life in prison if he's convicted on all counts. Jane, as she's called in court to protect her identity, is a former girlfriend of Combs and an alleged victim at the center of the government's case. She took the stand for a third straight day, a slender figure with long dark hair, appearing composed but visibly tense. Dressed in a modest blouse and blazer, Jane gripped the edges of the witness box as she prepared to continue her testimony. At around 9:30 a.m., with the jury seated and courtroom observers leaning forward in anticipation, Assistant U.S. Attorney Maureen Comey resumed her direct examination, all eyes fixed on Jane, including Combs's. The music mogul, 55, watched in silence, his expression hard to read, as this anonymous woman from his inner circle prepared to unveil more of the dark secrets of their relationship. Jane's role in Combs' world was not one of an employee or business associate, but rather something more personal and more insidious. She dated Combs from 2021 to 2024, becoming enmeshed in his glamorous yet treacherous orbit. Prosecutors allege these drug-fueled group sex sessions, casually termed hotel nights or freak-offs in Combs' circle, were not consensual trysts, but rather carefully orchestrated acts of exploitation. I felt like a sideshow and a sex worker in my own relationship, Jane had texted Combs in late 2023, as jurors saw earlier in the trial. These messages, shown on screens in the courtroom, set the stage for Jane's testimony about the erosion of her autonomy and the psychological chokehold Combs allegedly had on her life. When Maureen Comey asked Jane to describe one particularly brutal incident, the witness's composure visibly falters. Her voice quavers as she recounts a very terrible day, June 18, 2024. On that day, Jane says, an argument between her and Combs exploded into graphic violence and ultimately forced sexual humiliation. The confrontation had been brewing. Jane testified that she had been bottling up a lot of resentment and anger toward Combs. She was fed up with his constant infidelities and the young women who rotated through his life. That afternoon, at her Los Angeles home, she confronted Combs about a woman he had recently been with on a trip. Combs, a former college football player and still imposing in build, bent over during the argument, and Jane shoved his head downward, slamming it against the kitchen countertop. Enraged, Combs came after her. Jane hurled decorative candles at him in panic. Hot wax splattered his clothes and glass shattered, although she isn't sure if any of the heavy candle jars struck him directly. Terrified, she retreated to her bedroom and shouted for him to leave. Instead, Combs kicked in her bedroom door with such force that the frame splintered. Jane fled into an adjoining bathroom and tried to lock it, but Combs pursued, kicking the bathroom door literally off the hinges, she testified. Inside the cramped bathroom, the assault escalated. He kicked me on the back of my thigh, Jane recalled, her voice trembling as jurors leaned forward. The blow sent her sprawling. In seconds, Combs was upon her. He put me in a chokehold on the ground and I couldn't breathe, she said, describing how his forearm cinched around her neck. She felt her airway close as she struggled desperately, the edges of her vision blurring. Jane's eyes welled at the memory. In the jury box, a few jurors exchanged stunned glances, absorbing the alleged brutality. At this point in her testimony, Jane's facade of composure began to crack. She drew a shaky breath. Tears gathered in her eyes as she described what happened next. Somehow, Jane managed to wrench free from Combs's grip and escape the bathroom, bolting past the broken door and out of sight. She hid for nearly 2 hours on the property, crouching in a dark corner of the backyard, she said, hoping Combs would cool off and leave. When she finally crept back into the house, she thought the worst was over. She was wrong. Jane testified that upon re-entering her house, she found Combs still there and still seething. He spotted her and kicked open a guest room door where she tried to find refuge. Jane ran again, dashing out to the backyard patio as dust settled, but Combs caught up to her in the yard. "I remember that I punched him and he punched me," she said quietly. Out on the lawn under the dim evening sky, Jane's resistance finally gave out. Combs allegedly tackled her to the ground. As she curled into a ball, arms over her head, she felt his fists and feet pummeling her body, blows to her back, her ribs, as he ignored her sobbing pleas to stop. He grabbed her by the hair on one arm and dragged her across the grass, yanking her in the direction of the house as she kicked and screamed. Inside again, shattered glass and overturned furniture testified to the chaos of their fight. Jane noticed Combs' smartphone lying on a table, lit up. In a daze of adrenaline and anger, she snatched his phone and did something seemingly irrational. She called the other woman she suspected Combs had been seeing. "I ended up calling the girl I assumed he was with," Jane explained to a riveted jury. Perhaps she wanted the woman to know what was happening. According to Jane, Combs pinned her down and forced her to listen as the other woman's voice crackled through the phone, hurling insults at Jane while Combs held it to her ear. She could hear the woman calling her crazy and jealous. Combs made her listen to every word, effectively compounding her humiliation. Only after this cruel episode did the frenzy of violence subside. Shaking and in pain, Jane made her way to the master bathroom mirror. Her face was a ruin. 2 swollen welts on her forehead, a tender black eye blossoming, bruises forming along her thigh and arms. In the mirror's reflection, she barely recognized herself. She stepped into the shower to wash off the blood, sweat, and tears. It was then, Jane testified, that Combs reappeared one more time. He flung open the bathroom door. Jane startled as Combs slapped her across the face, 3 sharp stinging blows causing her to stumble naked against the tile wall. She cried out, but he remained eerily calm. In the stunned silence of the courtroom, several jurors shook their heads. Jane understood immediately what it meant. The night was far from over. Combs expected her to hide the evidence of the beating, put some ice on it, and then prepare herself for sex, put an outfit on, as if nothing had happened. So in a state of shock and survival, Jane obeyed. With trembling hands, she applied thick layers of foundation and concealer to her bruised face, sweeping her hair over her black eye to mask it. She slipped on a piece of lingerie and high heels, as instructed. All the while, Combs moved methodically, as if following a grim routine. He put on some pornography on a screen and, chillingly, grabbed Jane's own phone. In front of her, he used it to summon a man named Anton, one of the male escorts he had on call for these freak-off encounters. "Anton will be here soon," he essentially told her. The implication was unmistakable. After the violence, Jane was now expected to perform sexually for Combs' amusement with a stranger, as if she were nothing more than an object. As Jane reached this part of her testimony, her voice began to shake. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering herself. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she described the depravity that followed. Anton arrived at the house that night to find Jane dolled up in lingerie, her makeup hiding contusions. Combs offered Jane an MDMA pill and ordered her to take it, she said. "Get out there and perform oral sex on him." These crude instructions hung in the air, and more than one juror looked visibly disturbed. Jane testified that she protested, sobbing, "I don't want to, I don't want to, I don't want to," over and over. At this recollection, Jane's composure finally cracked on the stand. She began to weep openly, covering her face as she remembered her own pleas. "I don't want to," she had cried, but Combs was implacable. Under his unyielding glare, she relented. With shaking fingers, Jane placed the pill on her tongue and swallowed, knowing it was easier to comply than to suffer more pain. Moments later, in the flickering light of the pornographic video Combs had queued up, Jane knelt in front of Anton and performed oral sex on the man as Combs watched from a few feet away. The jurors listened in stunned silence as Jane haltingly described this forced act. One female juror's face turned away momentarily, unable to meet Jane's eyes during the most graphic details. "For how long?" Prosecutor Comey asked gently, referring to the ordeal. "It just felt like forever," Jane replied, her voice small. When it was finally over, Jane's nightmare still did not end. She testified that the next morning, Combs' assistant and a bodyguard showed up at her door carrying a stack of cash, about $10,000 to $12,000 in loose bills. Jane understood this to be hush money and damage control. "It was for Anton and for the damages in the house," she said bitterly. Combs was effectively paying off the witness to her degradation and covering the cost of the havoc wrought during the fight. Jane was instructed to give a portion of the cash, $3,000 to $4,000, to Anton as compensation for his night services and silence, which she did via an Uber delivery, keeping the rest to fix her broken doors. The prosecution produced Uber records confirming that Jane had indeed ordered a car to courier cash to someone named Anton the following day. They also displayed photographs of the splintered bedroom and bathroom doors, which Jane had sent to a repair contractor, images that corroborated her account of Combs kicking them in. In the courtroom, those photos of smashed hinges and cracked wood were shown to the jury. The physical evidence gave stark support to Jane's words. Several jurors exchanged looks of anger and astonishment. Combs himself sat stone-faced through the testimony, occasionally whispering to his attorney but betraying little emotion as the details of his alleged brutality and coercion spilled into public record. And despite the trauma, Jane did not immediately leave Combs for good. In fact, astonishingly, she continued to see him and even participate in more hotel nights in the weeks and months that followed, a fact the defense is sure to seize upon. The prosecution took pains to address this seeming contradiction, why a victim would return to her abuser, by illuminating the psychological and financial hold Combs maintained over Jane. He even paid for cosmetic procedures to shape her to his liking. Jane testified that he financed a set of porcelain veneers for her teeth because he didn't like my teeth, essentially buying her a pretty smile to suit his tastes. Such was the extent of his influence that Jane felt obligated to repay him with obedience and sexual availability. She told the jury that Combs would constantly remind her of his monetary support, threatening to cut her off financially if she refused to participate in his fetishistic hotel nights. In text messages from August 2023 revealed in court, Combs explicitly tied money to sex. He bragged about putting $15,000 on her credit for furnishings in her new house, then grew angry when Jane hesitated to engage in another group sex night, accusing her of using him for money. "I'm about to really disappear on you, you feel me?" Combs warned in an audio voice note played for the jury, implying he'd abandon her financially. "You better get on your job because you got me on my job," he said in a menacing tone. The courtroom heard this recording of Combs' voice, cold, annoyed, issuing an ultimatum. Jane testified that she understood exactly what he meant by her job, taking care of him, being good to him, and making sure he was happy, which included submitting to the sexual encounters, while his job was footing the bills. In other words, her body in exchange for his money, an arrangement that prosecutors argue lies at the heart of the sex trafficking charge. It was a devil's bargain Jane felt she couldn't escape. She continued to play the role he demanded even as her resentment grew. In one text, after yet another degrading hotel night, she told Combs that he was making things feel completely transactional lately and threatening me any chance that you get. He responded with a curt dismissal, "Girl, stops." This toxic cycle of coercion and capitulation helps explain why, despite the June 18th assault and forced encounter, Jane remained under Combs' sway. Only a few weeks after that nightmare night, Jane agreed to meet Combs again. In late July 2024, roughly a month after he had nearly choked her unconscious, she flew to Miami to see him. Jane admitted it sounds unthinkable, but she was still emotionally entangled by his influence over her life. Combs greeted her in Miami with promises of a fun reunion. Jane testified that he introduced her to a new drug, a liquid form of MDMA, Molly, which they took together before embarking on yet another freak-off session with a male escort named Paul. She described the experience as having high-octane sex fueled by the narcotic. It was yet another instance where drugs blurred the edges of her reluctance. The pattern repeated itself in August 2024 when Jane made what would be her final trip to see Combs. That time, she testified, the entertainer Combs procured for the encounter was a man she called Don, with whom she likewise had sex at Combs' behest while Combs looked on. Each encounter left Jane more traumatized and physically battered. She suffered health consequences from the sustained abuse, frequent urinary tract infections that required antibiotics, lingering pelvic pain after each hotel night, and even injuries related to body modifications she underwent for Combs. Earlier in the trial, she had testified that she got nipple piercings at Combs' request. He told her it would turn him on, and only to have them snag painfully on lingerie during rough sex, causing bleeding and nipple infections. When she removed the piercings to let her wounds heal, Combs scolded her and told her he never wanted to see her without them again, pressuring her to reinsert the jewelry despite the damage it caused. On the stand, Jane described how her back ached from the contorted sexual position she was forced into for hours on end, and how sometimes she would hide her pain and endure another freak-off rather than complain. In order to numb herself and keep up with Combs' marathon sessions, Jane said she often took ecstasy or other stimulants, sometimes supplied by Combs, to disassociate from the incredibly intense experiences happening to her body. This testimony painted a stark picture of the physical toll these years took on her. By September 2024, fate intervened to finally pull Jane out of Combs' orbit. On September 26, 2024, federal agents arrested Sean Combs in connection with the very crimes now being tried in this courtroom. Just days before the arrest, unaware of what was coming, Combs had been texting Jane inviting her to visit him in New York for yet another rendezvous, a trip she ultimately never took because he got arrested. Jane did not immediately rush to cooperate with law enforcement. In fact, she had been conflicted and fearful about turning on the man she once loved. Her testimony revealed a surprising twist. Combs himself was paying for the attorney who represented her during this period, and his defense team had been in contact with her. Jane confirmed that she hired a lawyer in late 2024 after FBI agents showed up at her home following the highly publicized November 2023 lawsuit filed by singer Cassie Ventura. Cassie's bombshell civil suit against Combs, alleging a decade of abuse eerily similar to what Jane later described, had made headlines and apparently prompted federal investigators to dig deeper. Combs had quickly settled Cassie's suit for $20 million without admitting wrongdoing, but the allegations spurred the current criminal probe. Jane testified that Combs began footing her legal bills after federal agents approached her, a move that could be interpreted as a gesture of support or an attempt to keep her close and controlled. She acknowledged meeting with Combs' defense attorneys multiple times between his arrest and the trial as they probed what she might say. In fact, Jane revealed that the first people she ever told about the violent June 2024 incident were Combs' own lawyers, not the prosecutors. As her direct examination drew toward a close on day 19, Assistant U.S. Attorney Comey posed a final series of questions to address what the defense has insinuated all along, Jane's motives. "Have you ever filed a lawsuit against Sean?" Comey asked pointedly. It was a chance for Jane to clarify that she was not seeking a payday, unlike the civil suits that Combs' camp has characterized as money grabs. "No," Jane answered firmly. She had never sued him. "Sitting here today, how do you feel about Sean now?" Comey continued. This was perhaps the most surprising moment of all. After describing monstrous abuse, one might expect Jane to express hatred or anger. Instead, Jane's face softened. In a voice barely above a whisper, with tears still glistening on her lashes, she said, "I just pray for his continued healing, and I pray for peace for him." Those in the courtroom were taken aback by the compassion in her words. A few jurors looked puzzled. One tilted her head as if trying to reconcile the horror Jane described with the empathy she still extended to the man allegedly responsible. Jane did not elaborate on why she felt that way, but her sentiment echoed something seen in other abuse survivors, a complicated mix of love, pity, and hope that the abuser might change. Notably, she expressed no desire for revenge or personal gain. She seemed, in that moment, genuinely sad. With that poignant statement, Jane's direct testimony concluded. It had been a marathon of emotion, nearly 3 full days on the stand, walking the court through 3 years of a relationship that started as a fairy tale and descended into a nightmare. Judge Subramanian adjourned the court for the day, allowing everyone to exhale. As the jurors filed out, many stole one last glance at Jane, perhaps marveling at her strength and the complexity of her testimony. For Sean Combs, the end of Jane's direct testimony marked a turning point. Thus far, the jury had heard only the prosecution side, a damning account of systematic abuse corroborated by texts, videos, photos, and Jane's own tearful recollections. Starting tomorrow, Combs' high-powered defense team, led by attorney Mark Agnifilo, will get its chance to cross-examine Jane. The atmosphere promises to be charged. Agnifilo is expected to probe every inconsistency, every delay in reporting, and every continued interaction Jane had with Combs in an effort to undermine her credibility. The defense has already previewed its strategy in public statements and court filings. They do not deny that Combs engaged in wild sexual escapades and even occasional violence. In fact, Combs' lawyers have acknowledged he was occasionally abusive in past relationships, but they insist that the freak-offs were consensual and that Jane and others participated willingly, motivated by the lifestyle and luxuries Combs provided. They will likely confront Jane with her own contradictory behavior, staying with Combs, accepting his financial support, even professing love for him despite the alleged abuse. Was she truly a captive victim or a willing partner in unconventional sexual exploits who later reinterpreted events as coercive? That is the doubt the defense hopes to sow. Moreover, the mistrial motion looming over the trial indicates the defense's aggressive approach. In that motion, which Judge Subramanian will address on day 20, Combs' attorneys claim prosecutors allowed false or misleading testimony from another witness earlier in the trial. Specifically, they targeted an inconsistency in testimony by singer Cassandra Cassie Ventura, Combs' ex-girlfriend of a decade and a high-profile accuser who took the stand days before Jane. Cassie told the jury she witnessed Combs assaulting her friend Brianna Bangalan by dangling her over a balcony edge in 2016, a shocking anecdote. But defense lawyers produced text messages suggesting Cassie hadn't seen it firsthand after all. She had texted Combs' assistant Christina Courtroom at the time saying, "I just found out some crazy shit," implying she learned of the incident secondhand. The defense argues prosecutors should have known Cassie's eyewitness account was flawed, and coupled with evidence that Combs was on the East Coast on the date of the alleged balcony incident, while Brianna's injury photos were time-stamped in Los Angeles, they cry foul. It's a reminder that contradictions in testimony can carry high stakes here, and while that particular dispute concerns Cassie's recollection, it underscores how crucial credibility will be when Jane faces cross-examination. Every detail of her story will be scrutinized. As day 19 ended, Sean Combs stood and buttoned his suit jacket, stealing a long look at the witness stand where Jane had just been excused. The two did not appear to make eye contact. Jane kept her head down, dabbing her face with a tissue offered by a courtroom deputy. In that moment, the contrast between them could not have been more stark. Combs, the artist formerly known as Puff Daddy, a man who once turned hip-hop into a global force and amassed a fortune in the process, now wears the mantle of an accused predator in a federal courtroom. And Jane, once an unnamed member of his entourage, a woman who says she loved him and suffered for it, has stepped from the shadows to become perhaps the most damning